right. Right on. If you need a Bible, raise your hand and our ushers will get you one. We're going to take off and land pretty quick because... So you ready? 2 Corinthians chapter 8 is where we're going to be today. We're in this series called Christian Atheists, and really what Paul's doing is he's writing a letter to the Corinthian church, a church that he loved dearly, a church that he started, a church that he was a pastor at. And what happened is this church started kind of going a different way than what Paul intended for them. They started gossiping about one another. They were divorcing one another. They were dividing among one another. They were sleeping with one another. They were suing one another. They were doing all these things. And Paul's like, you can't do these things. He confronted them, and he confronted how they were compromising. They were compromising their lives by sinning. And not only just sinning, but then they were justifying it. And so what Paul's saying is, you need to be of full maturity in Jesus. And he talks about this idea of lordship, that every part of our life falls under the lordship of Jesus. What does lordship mean? Well, it's a churchy word, really meaning that we make Jesus the master of our life. We allow Him to be the Lord, the Master, the God of every aspect, of every detail, in every area of all of our lives. You with me? So we accept Jesus, we like Jesus, but when it comes to this lordship thing, we go, I don't know so much. And I sense Paul's urge, because here's the deal. I want Mountain View to be a church where messy people can walk through these doors and they can feel at home because they're among other messy people, right? I want people to be able to walk through the doors and not feel guilt from their past, or I don't want people to walk through the doors and feel like they have to put on a certain persona or picture of themselves for everybody to love them and accept them. I want people to be able to come through these doors and be real. But if you're going to be a part of the Mountain View family, if you're going to become a part of Mountain View's the church family, then I want to urge you and I want to spur you on. I want all of us to encourage one another. I want us to edify each other. I want us to challenge one another to become fully mature in Jesus. And so that's what Paul's doing here. And so for today, we're going to talk about 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to look at how so many Christians believe in God, but don't live generous lives. There, I just said it. Here's the reason Paul addresses it in this letter. Because there's a common denominator between your faith and your generosity. There's a common denominator between what you believe in God and your maturity in God, your devotion to God, and your attitude towards generosity. Generosity seems to be a little bit revealing. It reveals your maturity. It reveals your immaturity in Jesus. And that's what's happening here. Paul's addressing this. He's not saying it's not about how much you give. It's about your perspective. It's about your attitude in which you give. I admit, the church can be painted in a bad light sometimes whenever we start talking about, right? Rubbing my fingers. That was good, man. Thank you. The church can be painted in a bad light whenever we start talking about money. But here's the issue. The issue is the Bible talks a lot about money. And we can't ignore it when we start talking about becoming fully devoted followers of Jesus. We just can't ignore it. Did you know that Jesus spoke on the subject of money more than any other subject? Did you know that there's over 800 references in the Bible about money? And so one of my responsibilities is to always teach and to preach the whole of what the Bible teaches us. Now, it could be fun to pick and choose the things that are fun or the things that I like. It could be exhilarating for me to only preach on the things that I enjoy, the adventure sides of the Bible. But then all I do is turn the Bible into Swiss cheese, and it would have all these holes in it from the things that I like. But what do we do with the rest? It's my responsibility. I'm urged to preach the wholeness of the Bible, the whole counsel of God. And that's one of the things that I need to do. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to cover this idea of I believe, but I'm not generous. I believe, but I need to check my attitude when it comes to generosity. I'm not here. This isn't a fundraising gimmick for Mountain View, so please don't hear, oh, Tom just needs more money for the church. No, we're working through this lordship stuff, and guess what comes up? Paul addresses it. So I'm going to share a couple of truths. We're going to look at some styles or some concepts when it comes to generosity. we're going to have a baptism and we're going to take up an offering, because whenever you talk about money, you should always take your offering after you talk about money. And so that's the only gimmick I have, okay? I hope you know I'm kidding you. But we are going to do it in that order, all right? And so here's just kind of the first truth. A lack of generosity may be the very thing. It may be the very thing that's hindering your growth in Jesus. A lack of generosity, a bad attitude when it comes to generosity, a wrong attitude about generosity, may be the thing that's keeping you from growing into that fully devoted follower of Jesus that He wants you to become. Now let me explain. I was talking to somebody not too long ago. They were talking to me about all these things they're involved in. I mean, the equivalent of 3 Bible studies. They come to church regularly. They serve regularly. But they just feel like their spiritual life has plateaued, that they've just stopped. And so I'm talking to them and I'm asking questions, and we're working through kind of this, I'm making it up as I go, self-assessment just to see why they're feeling this way. And so we get to this area and I said, well, how are you giving? Are you generous? Do you tithe? And this is what happened. It was a really long pause. I don't know for sure. But so many Christians have a hard time letting the Lord be the Lord in this area of our lives. We're like, I'm good with Him being in control of my career, but I don't know if I'm okay with Him having a sneak peek into my checkbook. I'm good with Him being the Lord of my life, especially when I get something out of it, like salvation and the promise of heaven and some things like that. But I don't really want Him to, He needs to mind His own business when it comes to my money. And that's what we're talking about here. When it comes to generosity, you can be stingy. You can be stingy, and you know what's going to happen? Nobody's going to call you out on it because it's such a private thing. Finances are something that we keep close, we keep tight. We don't let anybody in. And I'm not advocating that we should let people in. We should keep it private. We don't advertise. Could you imagine if you walked around with a bubble over your head about how much you make a year, and then the other bubble revealed how much you give a year? I mean, could you imagine if we did this? I mean, what would happen? If I knew what you give and what you make, I don't think my heart could handle it. I really don't. Because at Mountain View, we keep your giving private. I have no idea what you give. I have no idea what you don't give. I don't have any idea what you make or don't make. I just don't know these things. And one of the reasons that we don't know that information, that I don't know that information, is I couldn't handle it. My heart couldn't take it. Could you imagine if we all knew what we gave and if we all knew what we made, we would judge, we would criticize, we would be envious, we would compare ourselves, and our hearts couldn't handle this information. So yes, I think we should keep it private, but what is happening is, it's easy to celebrate somebody who can play the keyboard because we see them practicing their gift and exercising their gift, and we say, thank you for that. Or when we see them serving as a Sunday school teacher, we think, way to go. Or we see them doing something outside of the church. It's easy to recognize those things, but because this area of generosity is private, we don't talk about it. And so you could be stingy, you could be tight, and nobody would ever know. And so since we've been talking about this idea of lordship throughout this whole series, here we are. Here we are again. And I'm saying that you could go years without being a generous person, and nobody would ever know it. And so today what I've been praying is that God would just send His Holy Spirit to work and to admonish and to convict and to do whatever He needs to do in your life, because I don't know where you're at in this attitude of generosity. Paul's going to admonish the Corinthian church for their attitude of generosity. Paul's not going to demoralize them. He's not going to shame them. He is going to encourage them. He is going to challenge them. He is going to edify them to be bigger in this area, to grow in their maturity in this area. So look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. It says this. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in the wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. And so what he's saying is, he's saying, listen, the Macedonian churches, they gave more than they made. And I didn't have to beg them. I didn't have to plead with them. I didn't have to twist their arms to do this. Look at verse 4. Begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God. That's an important line for us to look at. But this is what's happening. Paul started kind of in the church of Jerusalem. The church of Jerusalem sent him out, and he went on these missionary journeys. And what he did is he started churches in all these different cities. He'd start a church. He'd raise up some leaders, he'd be their pastor, and then he'd move on to another city and he'd do it all over again. And so he went about doing this stuff. Well, what happened is the original church, the sending church, the mother church, if you will, in Jerusalem, they were having a hardship. As a matter of fact, they were in a famine, and so they were having some financial struggles at the time, and the economy crashed and all sorts of things happened. And so what Paul thinks, he thinks, listen, I need to call all the churches, write a letter that has to go by horse and buggy. And so this is a long process. You with me? But Paul says, I need to call all the churches. I need to ask all the churches to take up an offering, and we're going to send it to Jerusalem. We should. They're the ones who kind of helped me start the churches in all these places. So that's what he does. And then the money starts to come in, and the offering plate from Macedonia comes in, and he's thinking, whoa! Look at this. I can't believe it. They've given so much. They gave abundantly. They went far above and beyond what I ever thought they would give. And he was surprised because Macedonia was an area that was also struggling financially. They were landlocked, so the trade was minimal. They had a lot of college-age type students. They were also kind of in a famine. And they hardly had anything to give. And so here they are. They're giving this huge offering. And Paul's getting the offering back. And he's thinking, I can't believe how awesome this is. This is incredible. He's overwhelmed. That's why he says in verse 5 of chapter 8, he says what? They gave themselves first to who? The Lord. This idea of lordship. They gave themselves first to the Lord. But this is what happens. Paul then gets the offering plate back from the church in Corinth. And he's shocked. He's overwhelmed, but for the opposite reasons. He's thinking, Corinth is a city with wealth. They're affluent. They've got trade. They've got money. They've got money in the banks. This is all they sent? So he's surprised. He's shocked. And so Paul's not saying that the church in Corinth is less spiritual than the church in Macedonia, but he is saying that the Macedonian Christians revealed their maturity, revealed their lordship through their generosity. They didn't have as much, but their maturity and their faith was revealed to other people. Paul urged the Corinthian church then, grow in your maturity in Jesus. He should have probably sent the plate back and passed it again, but he didn't. He said, this is not about the money. This is about the heart. This is about lordship. This is about the attitude of generosity. That's what this is about. He's not putting these two churches up against each other, trying to size them up. That's not what's happening. It's not a fundraising gimmick. It's accountability. So that's the first truth. The second truth is this. Generosity doesn't have anything to do with how much we make. It just doesn't. A heart of generosity has very little to do with the amount of money we make from our jobs. You can be rich and generous, and you can be poor and generous. And you can be rich and stingy, and you can be poor and stingy. And so it's not about how much you make, it's about the heart in which we give it. And so Paul's saying, listen, generosity doesn't have much to do with how much you make. If the Macedonian church would have waited until they had the means to take up an offering, do you think they would have ever taken up the offering? Probably not. They'd be waiting for a really long time. Instead, they took full advantage of the moment. They took full advantage of the opportunity. They seized the opportunity. I really do believe that most of us want to be generous people. I think that it's ingrained in us to be generous people, but we fight against it. And the reason we fight against it is because life happens, doesn't it? I mean, life happens, and all of a sudden we think, oh, well, there's circumstances, there's situations, we've got an emergency, the company downsized, I just lost my job, the kids needs things, the kids are going to college, and we say, someday when I get through this, I will be generous. I have every intention of being generous. But think about this. You're a college student. You think, well, I don't have much money. I'm a college student. Maybe when I get a job, I'll start being generous. And so you go through college being this poor college student, never practicing this idea of generosity. And then all of a sudden you graduate and you've got to find a job. And you've got to move out of the dorm. And so you've got to find a place to live. And you apply for a job. Well, now you have to have clothes for the job. Now you have to have a car to get to the job. And you think, oh, all this expensive stuff. As soon as I pay this off and get settled in my job, I'll be generous. But then you meet her. And she's expensive. She costs money. She wants to go do fun things. She wants you to go out with her. And at some point she wants you to buy her a ring. And you think, oh man, I got my job and now I've got her. And as soon as we get married and settled, then I'll be generous. But then you get married and settled and she wants a house. And you think, I just don't know that I could afford this house. But we can do it, but I really want to be generous. But so maybe once we get settled and all this happens, but then they have kids and you're reading online somewhere that they cost $1 zillion per child in a lifetime to pay for. And you think, there's no possible way I can be generous right now. We've got this house, we've got these cars, we've got these jobs, we've got all this stuff. How are we going to be generous? And then you think, oh, as soon as they grow up. But then they go to college. And they need you to sign loans, and they go to college, and you think, well, as soon as this is all taken care of and they're out on their own, then I'll be generous. And so they graduate, they get jobs, they get settled, but you realize you've never done anything towards your retirement because you've been paying for these kids all these years. And so now every ounce of your extra income needs to be socked away into your retirement account because there's no way you're going to retire. You're always going to be working for the rest of your life. And as soon as I get a nice little nest egg, then I'll be generous. But then these kids of yours, guess what they do next? They have kids. And then they want you to come and visit them, and they want you to buy them things, and they want you to help with them. And you think, well, man, once their kids grow up and they're on their own, then I'll be generous. By that time, you're dead. I really do believe we have it in us to be generous people. The question is, are you going to keep making every good intention, or are you actually going to do it? That's what Paul is commending about the Macedonian church. He's saying, you did it. You took hold of the opportunity. You seized the moment. You took advantage of this. We spend our entire lives intending to be generous, but the point is we're missing out. We're missing out on the work that God's wanting to involve you in and what He's trying to accomplish across this globe with your intentions. And so Paul says in chapter 8, verse 6, accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. Did you notice through this entire section, what's Paul talking about? It's green. It's got a face on it. He's talking about money, but did you notice? He never once uses the word money here. Paul's saying it's more than that. He's using the word grace instead. He's using the word willingness. He's using the word earnestness and abundance. Why? Because Paul's saying, don't misunderstand. This isn't about me. This isn't about the churches. This is about something so much bigger than that. Generosity is about God and doing God things and doing, like Wally says, doing God's things God's way. And he's saying, this is why I've chosen these words specifically, because it's not all about me. Look at verse 7. Paul says, but as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in earnestness, and in our love for you, see also that you excel in this act of grace, this act of giving, this act of generosity too. So it brings me to the third truth is this. Generosity should never be forced. It should always be developed. That's what Paul's saying here. He's saying, you've accomplished these things, but keep going. Develop this attitude of generosity. You shouldn't feel guilted. You shouldn't feel manipulated. You shouldn't feel conned into generosity. It should be developed in your life. That's what you should be doing. And this is why it gets tricky to preach about generosity. Because there's some of you here who are excelling in this area of generosity. Your attitude about generosity is more than intentions. You're actually doing it. And for that, man, I want to just tell you thank you. Thank you for being generous to Mountain View. Thank you for being generous to the work that we're doing here. But here it is. There's some of you, as soon as I started talking about this, you started getting uncomfortable because you know what I'm going to say. I don't know what spectrum of generosity you're on. But what Paul's saying here is grow, mature, develop this attitude of generosity. I don't know where you're at. But if you're doing nothing and all you have is good intentions, Paul's saying to you here, develop it. Grow in it. I don't know where you're at. Look at this. I've got a couple of statistics from a website called The State of the Plate. I think it's the cheesiest name for a website in the world. That's my opinion. Hopefully they didn't hear that online. But anyway, State of the Plate says 77% of those who tithe give 11 to 20% or more of their income, far more above the baseline of 10% that we assume is a tithe number, all right? 97% of tithers make it a priority to tithe to their local church. Get this, 63% started giving 10% or more between childhood and their 20s. So those who are tithing started when the intention first began. Do you catch that? Why? Because intentions don't ever lead us to actually doing it. Jump down to the next one. The study found that tithers comprise only 10 to 25% of families in the church, but they often provide 50 to 80% of the church's income. So get this. This is what it's saying. That among you right here, 10 to 25% of you are tithers, and you're providing 50 to 80% of our need. Isn't that crazy? And so do you see why Paul's addressing this with a church who says, I believe in God, but I don't know that God can have permission to be the Lord in this area? Paul's saying, this is what it's about. Lordship. Are you going to let Him into this area too? I believe, but He just can't deal with that piece of me. I'm asked often, how much should we give? How much should we give? There's this ongoing debate about tithing. Those who debate it, I think, are missing the overall point. I just do. God is concerned about your attitude of generosity. With that said, I clearly agree to and I share what I understand, that I would affirm this concept of percentage giving, okay? So I do affirm that. But it gets tricky. Because what percentage do you give? Well, if you follow the Old Testament, people say, well, that's the Old Testament. It's like 20%. It's 20% of what you bring in. God's required you. If you're going to be in favor with God, God required you to bring it. And so we say, well, that's the Old Testament. It's the New Testament, and that's under grace. And so what is it then, Tom? What is the percentage? Well, it's interesting because if we're under grace, because Jesus essentially gave it all, doesn't that mean we should give it all back? So do you see how the arguments break down all of a sudden? And then if you study the book of Luke and you see, what did Jesus really say about giving and percentage? Well, He met with the rich young ruler, and you know what He told the rich young ruler? Give it all. He said, how much should I give? And Jesus said, 100%. And you think, huh? And then in another conversation, He's talking with the Pharisees, and He affirms to the Pharisees that they should be giving 10%. But then He has this conversation with Zacchaeus, this tax collector, and Zacchaeus comes to the conclusion that he should give 50%, and Jesus affirmed that too. So what percentage should you give if we're in this percentage mindset? Is it 10? Is it 50? Or is it 100%? And I think that that's where it breaks down. The attitude of generosity is what's important here. The attitude of generosity is the starting point. I don't think that if you give 10% of your income, you can say, I fully developed this. I'm good to go. I've let the Lord have it, because you could give 10% all your life and never continue to mature and develop in this attitude of generosity. You can say, well, 3% is a stretch for me, and so I'm going to stick with 3%. But the point is that Paul's saying is you need to excel, you need to mature, you need to develop, you need to grow in this attitude of generosity. Are you catching what I'm saying? It's not about what you give. It's not about how much you give. It's about the heart in which you give it and the idea of maturing and growing and developing in your faith. 3 last things, and I need to go fast. There's three mindsets of giving that you're going to hear, especially taught in the church, and 2 of them I disagree with them. One I buy into wholeheartedly. Okay, so I'm just going to say that up front. The first one I disagree with is this idea of prosperity generosity. Prosperity generosity basically says, you know what? I'm going to use God as an investment strategy. I'm going to give God $100, and He's going to give me $200 back. All right? So here's the big trick. I can't read that anywhere. I do read that you are blessed when you give, right? But the idea of prosperity generosity takes out the idea that God gave it all to you in the first place. It's that in some way, in some form and fashion, you've earned it all yourself, and you don't really need God to be involved in it. But God sure does sound like a good investment strategy, so I'll give Him 100, expecting that He'll give me 200 back. Could you imagine if I told you today, hey, when we pass the offering bags, God really told me that if you give $100, He's going to give you $200 in the mail this week. I can't do that. Does that make sense? I can't find that. Has God done that in some of your lives? Yes. But there are people I know who are the most generous people I've ever met in my life. And it seems like junk of the world dumps on them all the time. So I disagree with this idea. We can talk about it more later. But the second idea is this, poverty generosity. It's the opposite of prosperity generosity. Poverty basically says you should feel guilty if you have anything. I mean, you got 2 cars, you only need 1. You live in a house, and you only sleep in 1 bedroom, it's too big for you. You need to give it away. You need to give it away. You need to give it away. You see what I'm saying? And so poverty generosity says, no, you can't earn anything. And I can't find that to be true in the Bible either. This is what I believe in. I believe in this thing called gospel generosity. Gospel generosity is this. God has blessed you with so much. And He's blessed you with so much so that you can bless others with much. It's the idea of paying it forward. Where Jesus says, here, I've given you all of this. Now would you please take it and give it to others? Would you use it to fulfill my purpose and my mission and my goals and what I desire? You give as a response to what Jesus has done in your life. That's what it is, and that's what reveals your maturity in Jesus. Jesus gave it all. Therefore, we are going to develop and we're going to work on this attitude of generosity. And here's the trick. With the correct and with the growing, with the developing attitude of generosity, you know what's going to happen? You're going to be blessed. It's true. This is what I was talking about last week. Lordship isn't intended to be a burden. Lordship is intended to be a joy. Think of the joy you'll experience when you develop this heart of generosity. That's why at Mountain View we do things like practicing 4 ways of generosity. You know why we do that? Because there's some of you in here, you don't have the heart of generosity yet. So we want to give you little opportunities to practice it. Why do we do projects like the roof or the kitchen? Well, some of that is because God gives us a kitchen and we thought it would be a better use to put it in the kitchen and use it than set it up as yard ornaments. And so we decided we need this and we're going to have to raise some funds to do it. And it's a great opportunity for those of you who don't have the heart of generosity to practice. We sponsor children in Africa, $38 a month. Why? So that you can practice generosity. So you can see what it's like, but then we have to develop and we have to mature. So here are the questions. What does your attitude of generosity reveal about your maturity in Jesus? What does your spending reveal about what is most important? And what does your generosity reveal about your involvement in God's mission on this earth? Those are 3 really important questions for you to consider as you develop your heart of generosity. Verse 9 of chapter 8 says this, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though He was rich, yet for your sake He became poor, so that you by His poverty might become rich." Let me tell you, people, today, this is the gospel message. This is the gospel message. Jesus was rich and He became poor so that He could share His generosity with you so that you might become rich. Jesus experienced a big downsizing himself when he put on the flesh of the human body. When he left heaven, Jesus came to serve others. He came to give and not to receive. He was humble. This is what we call the gospel message, and that's why Paul said he gave first their heart, their life to the Lord. That's the gospel message. And one of the coolest things that we get to do today is see somebody who says, I hear the gospel message. I believe the gospel message. I catch what Jesus did for me. I understand it in ways that I've never understood it before. What do I need to do with it? Man, believe. Believe what Jesus did for you. Accept it as His gift to you. Respond publicly with it. Tell people across the world that I believe in this Jesus and I believe what He did for me. And one of the ways we do that is we're baptized. We're baptized. Because it's the outward confession of I believe in what Jesus has done. But don't stop there. Keep growing. Keep maturing. Keep developing.